Hello and welcome to today's soil health webinar titled Soil Health for Wildlife and Fisheries Managers, Why Should I or We Care by Kent Solberg. This webinar has financial support from the North Central Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, or SARE, and we'd like to thank them for their support. I am Wayne Munson and I am moderating this webinar. I work with the SFA as a Special Projects Coordinator. I have a couple of housekeeping issues before we start today's webinar. Kent and I will be the only speakers. Kent will be the only one speaking during his presentation. Everybody else will be muted. During Kent's presentation, you can write questions in the chat box and then send them in. On the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there should be a chat box icon. You can click on that, and the box will open up in the lower right. And you can type in your question and send it in. And then after Kent's presentation, we will have time for the questions to be read. And I will read them to Kent, and he will attempt to answer and discuss your topics. Now I'd like to introduce Kent Solberg. Kent has a Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife Biology from the University of Montana and a Master of Science degree in Wildlife and Fisheries Science from South Dakota State University. He has worked for various agencies for 17 years, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, North Dakota Game and Fish Department, Missouri Department of Conservation, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and a Soil and Water Conservation District. Kent has been farming using the principles of agroecology for 24 years and has been teaching agroecology principles and practices for the past 8 years. Kent currently serves as the SFA's Livestock and Grazing Specialist. Thank you, Kent, and we look forward to the information you will share with us on today's webinar. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you all for being here this afternoon before the big holiday weekend. Help you ease into your holiday weekend here with our presentation. As most of us know, agriculture has the most extensive effect on fish and wildlife habitat of any human activity out there. And it really comes down to not a question of if there will be agriculture, but how are we going to do food production for over 7 billion mouths and growing in the future. For the past 7 or 8 years, this concept of soil health has been buzzing in agricultural circles. Over the next few minutes, we're going to be looking closer at what soil health looks like and what it can mean for the fish and wildlife resource and for fish and wildlife managers. So if you're like me, when you were in college, you looked at courses like soils as something just to get through, to get onto the more interesting stuff that we got at mostly at a junior and senior level. And I think part of this attitude some of us has was that historically soils courses focused primarily on the physical and chemical realms of soils and only giving, or often only giving, a minor nod to the biological piece. And hey, we're biologists, so we were probably more interested in that. But recently, we've begun to learn more about the huge role that soil biology plays in our ecosystems and ecosystem functions. In 2007, about 10 years ago, Brady published this paper on the effects of cropland conservation practices on fish and wildlife habitat. This is an excellent literature review of commonly applied soil and water conservation practices and their effect on fish and wildlife habitat. This includes practices such as grassed waterways, conservation tillage, constructed terraces, and buffer strips. The caution I would offer here is that these practices in themselves are not soil health. Oftentimes these practices were band-aids that were historically applied to fix a broken system. And that broken system is soil function. So we hear this term soil health being kicked around, and I think there's a little bit of confusion as to what it is. There's several definitions of it out there. The definition I like to use is that soil health is soil function. Soil function being number one, the ability to capture and store water. Um, we don't have a runoff problem. What we have is an infiltration problem. And the infiltration problem is because we've basically destroyed soil aggregate structure, and we'll get more into that as we go. The other piece of soil function is the ability to cycle nutrients. And if we can correctly cycle or appropriately cycle nutrients on the landscape, we're going to minimize any problems with anything that would perchance happen to run off or even leach or volatilize for that matter. Um, the bottom line here is soil health is more than cover crops, conservation, tillage, and precision nutrient management. And there are some people in the ag press that have kind of stopped with soil health by saying it's one of these practices. These are excellent practices. These are all great tools to move us towards soil health, but as a group or in amongst themselves, they are not soil health. If you only take away one thing from this webinar today, I hope it would be this slide, that 85 to 90% of soil health, or soil function, is mediated by soil microbial activity. This is something that's pretty revolutionary, I think, and kind of the focus of where we're going today. So that raises the question, how many microbes are out there in our soils? And this is from Nelson a few years back. Let's focus
things with electronics, but
primarily on the totals here. I'm not going to get into the species and subgroups so much today for our discussion, but let's look at the totals. And from a number of soil samples taken across the landscape, Nelson found that the ranges ran from about 1,000 pounds of microbes per acre to about 13,000 pounds per acre. Most typically we see in our row crop fields that soil populations are running about 1,000 to 2,000 pounds per acre. Some more recent work that has been done on assessing soil microbe populations across the country is that some of our conservation lands are showing less than even 1,000 pounds, or even less than what many of our row crop fields are doing for total living biomass of microbes out there. What we do see is that soil microbe populations approach are around 12 to 13,000 pounds. We see some absolutely huge benefits, not only for ecosystem services, but also for agricultural production. So many of us have seen diagrams or illustrations such as this in the past, whether that was in a high school or college course. Pretty common. There's several varieties of these out here depending on what is being communicated. But what I found interesting in putting this talk together and going back and looking at some of these diagrams on trophic levels is that oftentimes the soils piece is left out of these diagrams. And yet it's the soil and the ecosystem it is, and all the benefits it provides through healthy and active soil microbial communities, that's the foundation for everything else above it. I think soils have just been kind of left out of the picture, and we're finding out that that may have been a huge mistake, and we're just learning more about that all the time. So as wildlife managers like to talk about, it's all about habitat, and land use being the principal factor of that, and I think it holds true for determining soil microbe species diversities and population densities also. And I also believe, and I would argue, that habitat quality is also a function of soil health. And we're going to see some evidence, I think, related to that as we go here today. So it's only healthy and active soil microbial populations that build soil aggregate structure. And it's that soil aggregate structure that creates the pore space between the soil aggregates that allows for water infiltration to happen. And most of our commodity agricultural activities, modern industrial agricultural activities, have not been friendly to this. The good news is we've got methods and technologies to change this, and we'll talk about some of those as we go. Another aspect of this, back in the 1980s, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources published this little booklet here, and on page 7 in there, there's an illustration of land use on a specific township down on the Minnesota-Iowa border that was followed for 44 years based on some aerial photography. And there's a number of these out there. I've seen them for Iowa and other places in Minnesota. And the big take-home message from all of these is how we've simplified the agricultural landscape over the years. In 1940, we had very diverse crops in rotation, a higher percentage of perennials on the landscape, and a lot of that was because we had more livestock out on the landscape. Now, oftentimes as wildlife managers, we focus on habitat heterogeneity and juxtaposition, and those are two critical components of habitat and habitat management. Um, but I would say there's a third dimension that we haven't talked about much or explored much, and that's habitat quality in relation to soil health. Now, not that they were doing everything quote unquote right back in 1940, but there were a lot of soil health principles and practices that they were implementing probably without even knowing it, just doing it intuitively or out of tradition, that contributed to soil health far more than the much simplified agricultural landscape we've seen in the last 30 years. And I just want to make clear that I'm not going to advocate going back to that. I think we've got a whole bunch of advances we've made that we could do a far better job even today than some of the things we saw back in the 1940s. So that begs the question, how can we build soil microbe populations? Building soil health is basically habitat management for those soil microbes. These are species we can only see with a microscope, which makes it, I think, a bit of a challenge. You know, they're not quite as charismatic as eagles or moose or grizzly bears or whatever, but I think they're critical, absolutely critical to ecosystem functions and habitat well-being. Um, there are 5 principles that can be applied anywhere to build habitat for soil microbes. So let's take a look at those. Number 1, keeping the soil covered. This picture is actually on my own farm. This is a picture of a cover crop that had recently been grazed. You can tell by the cow pat here with a hoof print in it. And the animals have been pulled off. The cattle have been pulled off this site. That's the amount of residue, amount of cover we intended to keep on the soil for the winter to protect it. And what's the value of that cover? Well, we had a producer that's a cooperator of ours go out one day in a cornfield, and he shot a picture of a soil thermometer in that cornfield on a warm day, and that temperature registered 100 degrees. And just moments later, he went into an adjoining field that had covers in it and took the soil temperature again, and it was 20 degrees cooler. And that's one of the benefits keeping the soil covered provides, is a level of thermal insulation or thermal cover for those soil microbes. As temperatures climb, they can be very stressful for soil microbes. They like temperature ranges a lot like we do. You know, in the 70s, 80s, when it starts getting in the 90s, they start to get stressed. At 130, which is possible on a hot day with bare exposed soil, we start to see some levels of mortality. And at 140, basically, we start seeing some of the bacteria starting to die. It's low temperature pasteurization. It's what's going on. Conversely, in the winter, and I think a lot of us know this, if we've ever gone out and poked around in the snow, under the snow in the winter, that can help provide a level of insulation, minimizing how low those temperatures go in the winter. So that's very important to keeping those microbes comfortable. Excuse me. So there's been a number of research projects that have documented the value of covered soils for fish and wildlife. One is higher invertebrate prey base, greater foraging opportunities for wildlife species, greater diversity and density in nesting birds, and increased nest success over conventional tillage, and also as the winter food source for resident wildlife. So some of the practices, or this specific practice related to soil health, has some direct and indirect wildlife benefits. Excuse me. Number 2, minimize soil disturbance. Most of the time when we're talking about this in soil health and in agronomic systems, we're talking about no-till operations to get the least amount of tillage, but it can also mean incorporating perennials in a longer-term rotation as a way to reduce or minimize tillage. Now, both of these have some issues and pros and cons to each of those. We won't go into those maybe later a little bit, but these are two practices that can help us minimizing soil disturbance. Soil disturbance has been equated to something akin to a tornado going through our communities. It creates stress, it creates chaos, and it's a very difficult situation to live in. And if it's something that only comes along in a great while, there's opportunities for rest and recovery. But if it's something that's chronic, if something that's happening on a regular basis and there's no opportunity for rest or recovery, that stress and chaos is amplified to the point where that community just ceases to function. Some of the value of minimizing tillage for fish and wildlife that's been documented: greater prey base, higher nest success, higher relative abundance of bird species are some of the few that are out there. Increased crop diversity. Here's a picture of a complex cover crop. Look at all that great pollinator habitat out there. Increasing crop diversity is a huge principle. What we like to see, and I'm going to keep this in kind of an agronomic context for our discussion today, is at least one representative from each of the four major crop types. Warm season grasses, there's some examples there, warm season broadleaves, cool season grasses, and cool season broadleaves. We see the best results here. Cover crops can play a role in helping fill some of the gaps that are out there, and even going much farther in adding diversity to that rotation. Some of the immediate benefits or observed benefits to a diverse crop rotation for wildlife: reduced insecticide use is one, increase in habitat heterogeneity, increase in upland game bird brood habitat, and it also creates pollinator habitat depending on what species are in that rotation or in a cover crop blend if that's what we're using. So most of us with an ecological background have heard that diversity builds ecological stability. And this is a pretty powerful photo. It was taken a few years back, almost 4 years away, back here now. It was taken on August 20th. Temperatures went over 100 degrees that day. These adult Angus cattle are in a 29-way cover crop species mix that was planted on June 26th. It had only received 0.4 of an inch of rain when this picture was taken. I got this picture from someone else. They incorporated some different numbers in here, but it was 0.4 of an inch. It's pretty amazing how much vegetative growth we have there and what's going on, because typically cool season pastures, which need rest at this time, are really struggling under those conditions, and yet this field is thriving. You can see some heat stress in those plants. The leaves are starting to curl a bit, but it looks awfully good considering the environmental conditions that have been a part of this. And it just kind of reinforces that ecological stability that we typically reference to natural systems can be mimicked to some degree in agronomic systems using things like complex cover crop species. Number 4, keep a living root in the soil. Most biological activity happens at or near the soil surface and in association with a living root system. And I think that's really critical to note. There's been a lot of discussion in the last decades about the value of perennials for water quality, and that's true, but I think we've often equated that resource service to the plants themselves, when actually it's the plants are providing the habitat or the home for those microbes that are creating the soil aggregates, that are allowing that infiltration, that are minimizing that runoff, that are really doing the work. And that's something we've just recently have come to learn more about. You know, typically this is what we see in commodity row crop situations. There's just no living roots there. And yet we can go out to a perennial pasture, a road ditch, whatever, during a February thaw when this picture was taken, and there's green plants there. They're alive. Now, there's not a lot of biological activity going on there because of the cold temperatures, but they're ready to rock and roll as soon as the temperatures warm up, compared to a situation like this where we can go 7 or more months out of the year with no living plant out there. and thus no biological or very little biological activity. So there's some direct relationship to keeping a living root in the soil and the value to fish and wildlife above and beyond perennials. We've already talked about the value of a living root creating um, the soil aggregate structure that's going to allow water infiltration, that's going to benefit aquatic habitats. But even such practices as integrating winter wheat or triticale or cereal rye can create opportunities for providing upland bird nesting cover. Principle number 5, livestock integration. There's a host of ways we can do this. Um, and as we learn more about this, more and more scientists are coming forward and talking about the value of this, almost the overlooked value of incorporating livestock back into all of our systems, including agriculture. Sulc and Franzluebbers identified a number of things back in a few years back here on the integration of livestock into cropping systems. Number one, it can be effectively implemented in every agricultural region that's out there. There are new technologies to facilitate successful adoption of livestock integration into cropping systems. They have the potential for providing additional ecological services by capturing those positive interactions while avoiding negative environmental outcomes and sustaining or even enhancing, in many cases, farm profitability because there can be reduced input costs and reduced labor costs. There's a variety of options that are out there. We'll talk about some of those. To date, the primary adopters have been livestock managers because they're seeing almost immediate benefit by creating foraging opportunities for their livestock. There's more and more evidence, though, mounting, and there's some research going on now that I think we're going to see come to the forefront in the next few years, that the real winners on this could be the row crop producers. And the livestock producers are providing a service. Right now, it's a perception issue. I think the science will help change that. Perceptions are hard to change, and hopefully the data will give us the opportunity to change some of those perceptions. And management, like so many other things, is absolutely crucial for success in these type of systems. So what happens when we put livestock into the systems? Again, we're really just starting to collect some of this data now. This is just some raw soil sample data from eastern North Dakota in 2016. I'll explain a little bit to what's going on here. The top farm in the green, it says organic CT. That's an organic row crop operation. Very diverse cropping system. Continuous tillage on that system because they can't use synthetics, they can't use herbicides for weed control. So traditional organic system, heavily dependent upon tillage for weed control as well as crop rotation. There's no synthetics, obviously, because it's organic. There's also no livestock in that particular operation. The next farm down is a no-till operation. Very low diversity, only 2 crops in the rotation. Heavily dependent upon synthetics, both fertilizers and chemical insecticide use to maintain that operation. And there's no livestock in that operation either. Third operation is again another no-till operation. All these operations have been in existence for over 10 years. So the third one down is a no-till operation. Medium diversity, fairly diverse crop rotation, occasional use of some cover crops, usually in single species or small mixes of 2 or 3 species, but still very high synthetic use and no livestock integration. The fourth farm down, 20 years of no-till, very highly diverse crop rotation, lots of cover crop use, lots of complex cover crop use, no synthetics for at least 9 years. They are not certified organic, but they do integrate livestock extensively. Most of their fields see livestock at least once a year. Go down the columns under nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then water extractable organic carbon. Let's just take a look for today at water extractable organic carbon. That is the energy, that is the fuel that runs the system. That's what fuels the microbial activity. And just look at the numbers there. I mean, we're talking almost roughly a 5-fold increase in water extractable organic carbon, food for those microbes, and in turn, those microbes are making available for crop production NP and K in pretty amazing amounts. This same farm, the fourth farm down, their 2012 corn crop, and some of you have seen these numbers, but we got to get everybody on the same page here. So their 2012 corn crop on that fourth farm down, they no-tilled into a fall grazed cover crop, similar to the one we saw in the earlier picture with the Angus cattle in it. There was no fertilizer used on this field whatsoever other than what the cattle deposited. No herbicides or insecticides were used. There was no irrigation on that field at all, and it was a drought year that year. 2012, if you remember, bad drought, Nebraska, Dakotas, southwest Minnesota, Iowa. The crop that was planted was an open pollinated corn. It wasn't a triple stacked hybrid. It was just an old school open pollinated corn. And their corn crop that year was 29 bushel per acre greater than the 10-year county corn average. And that farm typically averages 25% higher corn yield than the county average in that area. But they were able to do this in a drought year with none of the typical inputs that we see. Their estimated cost of production was $1.44 a bushel. Now in 2012, corn was high. They sold it for $6.98 a bushel. But even at the current price of around $3 or just a little north of $3 a bushel, this is still a profitable corn crop. Other opportunities that we can see from livestock integration, it's a way to bring the next generation into the farm. Many of our current farm operators are north of 60 years old, hips, knees, back, whatever, aren't up to wrestling 800-pound steers anymore or lambing out ewes. It's an opportunity to bring the next generation in. As we've seen, cash crops can be more profitable, and because of that, farmers can farm much fewer acres. Getting livestock back on the landscape also can create a need for perennials and annual forages or pasture, and this creates a much broader crop rotation. There's also an opportunity for wetland restoration on some of these sites on the poorer producing fields. And Pheasants Forever, I know, has a tool out now to help producers identify these poorer producing fields, and often those have drained wetlands associated with them, and that can create another opportunity. Part of what makes this work is some of the technologies that are available to us, energized fencing technologies being one of those. Some of the other technologies are no-till and strip-till and how far that's come. New advances in weed control, precision ag and GPS systems, alternative forages and cover crops that are now available. One source says they have now identified 150 different cover crops available for North America. Not all work in the northern plains or in the upper corn belt, northern corn belt, but just they've identified that many, and that's an astounding number of options. Also, seeding technologies to integrate cover crops. There's a lot of work going on that right now. Dr. Scott Wells from the University of Minnesota just did a webinar with us here a few weeks ago, and part of his webinar talked about some of the work he's doing with new seeding technologies and the successes and failures they're having with that. So some of the integrated system options that are out there. Sod-based crop rotations. We've kind of touched on this already. It's something where you have cash grain crops and then move into an extended hay pasture segment of the rotation. Can be one way to do this. Grazing cover crops and a cash crop rotation. There's quite a bit of that going on. Crop residue grazing, corn being the most common. But there's often opportunities in small grain systems to do this too. Sod intercropping, we're seeing much more success. There's a lot of interest in this in the north, but we're seeing almost all the success with this just because of climate and latitude in warmer climates than we do in the northern areas. Multi-purposing cereal crops, such as oats, barley, or cereal rye, can be used as forage cover crops or grain. And then also agroforestry and silvopasture, and we're just not going to have time to dig too deep into that today. So I often hear, well, gee, that's great, Kent, but, most of these farmers got rid of the livestock decades ago. on many of these farms. How do we get those livestock back out there? Well, we're trying to address that a number of ways, and one of the ways is there was a joint task force put together with Minnesota Department of Ag, the NRCS, and SFA, and a number of us got together and developed the Cropland Grazing Exchange. We're not going to go into too much of how the mechanics of this work. Some of you may recall the conservation grazing exchange that was being used by Minnesota DNR and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here a few years back. It was hosted on the Minnesota Department of Ag website, as is the Cropland Grazing Exchange. And it's a way to bring row crop producers and livestock people together, an opportunity for them to communicate and see if there's an opportunity for them to work together and move soil health further ahead on particular fields. Cover crops. There's a myriad of options out there. These are just a smitten of examples that are available. Some considerations for cover crops. Sometimes when we look in the ag press, they kind of come across as the silver bullet, the fix-all, end-all to everything. They are an extremely valuable tool. I don't see them as the silver bullet. In some situations, they shine better than others, but they are extremely a valuable and effective tool, especially when used with other practices. And there's lots of options for them. I think first and foremost, I encourage producers to think about what are the resource concerns for that particular field. You know, is it poor soil aggregate structure, low soil organic matter? Is it a compaction issue? Is it a weed issue? Are you interested in doing something to benefit wildlife species and tie that into this? Do you want to use it as a forage crop? Are you going to graze it or are you going to hay it? Think through those things first, then select the cover crop species that's going to best address your needs. And there's some really good tools out there to help producers do that. Other things to consider is the cropping and herbicide history being crucial, not only for germination and establishment of that cover crop, but also we're finding some herbicide residual times being restrictive on what forage crops we can use for a certain amount of time following application of that herbicide. Something to be cautious about. Also rotations, how does the cover crop fit into the bigger rotation? What's going to be your subsequent cash crop after that? And then having a termination plan right up front on how you're going to handle with those things. So what does this mean to fish and wildlife managers? How can they get involved? How can the conservation community get involved? And like everything else, there's a lot to learn here. So I'd encourage you to continue to educate yourself on this, learn as much as you can, so you can be a voice out there for the value this can have. I'd encourage you to think about using soil biological testing methods to assess management activities on wildlife areas and conservation lands. You can either use the older PLFA or the newer soil bioprofiling. Soil bioprofiling is a much more powerful tool. It's a little more expensive, so if there's budgetary restrictions, you can fall back to PLFA. I'm not going to go into a lot of details on those unless somebody wants to during the Q&A period. But those are two tools I think we can use to assess the management we're doing out on WMAs, WPAs, and so on. Providing encouragement and support to producers looking to change. This is huge. There's some people that are really working on this. Most of our innovative farmers, our early adopters, they're dabbling in this stuff already, and some are pretty far down the road and doing a really good job at it. The group we're concerned about is our middle adopters, and that group is a huge part of the population spectrum of farmers that are out there. And for a lot of these folks, they're going to feel like they're the lone wolf out there if they step out and try and do some of this stuff. And that's scary to them. They need some cheerleaders. They need some mentors. They need some coaches on their side to help move them forward. You know, it's interesting because we can see so many wildlife benefits from doing these practices. And one of the primary goals for farmers in adopting conservation practices is for wildlife. That ranks very, very high. And so for those of you who are fish and wildlife professionals, to keep that in the back of your head as you're conversing with folks who may want to step out, if you can just encourage them along those lines and that it fits with what's a pretty common goal with many, many farmers out there, as they move forward with this. I think that would be very helpful. Helping educate stakeholder groups and individuals. This is a huge, huge opportunity for many of our NGOs that are out there. And some of them are already dabbling in this stuff. Some of them are already supporting us. Just for example, and I'm not going to cover them all, but the National Wildlife Federation's got a huge program supporting cover crop adoption and working to change the rules with RMA to make cover crops more doable in the Corn Belt, that's just absolutely priceless. Groups like Ducks Unlimited, Audubon, Trout Unlimited have been strong supporters of managed rotational grazing for years. And those are all great pieces and huge, but I think we can take it to another level. Not all the groups are on board with this stuff. More are looking at it all the time. It's just a huge opportunity, and you as professionals, I think, can help move this forward. The other is practice soil health principles on lands you have influence over, particularly new acquisitions. I think that's what you're going to find some of your greatest benefits from. You take that former corn or soybean field and you want to move it to perennial native cover. There's a huge opportunity here, I think, to use these principles to move forward on this. And I know a number of people who work in the wildlife and fisheries profession have their own land for recreational purposes or for whatever. Use these practices on your own land, even in your own garden. These practices can hold true for your own garden. A little hard to put a 1,100-pound cow on your raised bed garden, but there's other things you can that may fill that particular piece of the equation. And then whenever possible, purchase food products from producers that utilize soil health principles. For most people, that's going to be things like grass-finished beef or lamb or purchasing grass-fed dairy products. Those aren't the only examples, but they're just some of the most common available consumer products out there that can help. So a few final notes, a few final thoughts here. As we know, aquatic habitats are strongly tied to watershed, and an emphasis on soil health and agriculture is going to address so many issues with water quality in aquatic habitats. Applying the principles of soil health to agriculturally dominated landscapes is going to enhance all the other habitat management activities agencies and NGOs are doing out there. Because in an agricultural system that focused on soil health, I don't expect it to replace natural plant communities, nor to address all the habitat needs of any single species. However, a focus on soil health is going to address many of the core resource issues that we're struggling with, and they're going to provide a viable alternative to the historic efforts that were built simply to mediate ecological damaging agricultural practices that are out there. Some other notes, if we have an agriculture based on soil health, it's probably the greatest natural resource management opportunity that we're going to see in our lifetime. This is absolutely huge. The power of this is phenomenal. Soil health focused agriculture is going to provide a balance between sustaining food and fiber production for a growing population, and it's going to address a host of resource concerns at the same time. We currently have producers that are facing low commodity prices, and they're looking for options. At the same time, there's a huge volume of information on soil health, cover crops, managed grazing, no-till, precision ag that are out there right now. So they're getting bombarded with these messages, and at the same time trying to make decisions to keep their operations viable in the current economic environment. It's a huge opportunity to move soil health forward because we've just touched on a few examples of how viable it can be economically for producers. And maybe most importantly, soil health can become the common ground for farmers in the conservation communities. Historically, there's often been rifts here. There's often been tension. There's often been battles. And this can be the common ground, that I think can help repair some of those bridges that have been damaged in the past. So with that, I want to thank you. We do have time for some questions, and I'll turn it back to Wayne to open it up to some questions. you there, Wayne? Okay, I see a few questions on the chat
Okay.
board here. Oh, there he is.
Okay. There I am. I was hitting the wrong mute button. Yeah, can you compare and contrast a little bit more about what carbon farming is?
Yeah, carbon farming is kind of become another buzz type term in the kind of the agroecology community. I think everything we're talking about doing here fits under carbon farming. The whole focus of carbon farming is capturing and keeping atmospheric carbon and keeping just carbon in general stored in the soil. And all the practices we've talked about accomplish that, move us in that direction. I think there's been some struggle with semantics. Terms like sustainable have been so heavily co-opted that people are looking for other terms and other terms that kind of fit the language of the time. So that's where I see carbon farming, just another term for doing a lot of this stuff. Do we have another question?
Yeah, can you explain a little more what soil bioprofiling is?
Soil bioprofiling is technology taken from the medical field. It's DNA-based technology to identify, it's being used in the soil science world to identify species and subgroups of soil microbes in the soil profile. And it produces a very powerful pie-shaped chart. There, say that 3 times fast. That gives you relative abundance of total microbial biomass out there, as well as dividing out in slivers of that pie percentages or populations of the different soil microbes that are out there. And there's some benchmark farms that they can use to compare against, and people who start to use this tool can tell pretty quickly what sort of land management practices are being implemented above ground without actually even seeing the farm, just by looking at the analysis.
Thank you. Here's another question. Can you explain more about the table that contrasted the organic operation, the no-till operation, and the livestock, specifically the differences in the NP and K? And was this measuring concentrations in the soil?
Yes, it was measuring. I'm going to try and get back to that. Maybe the fastest way would be to go to here. There it is. So this is a slide I believe they're asking about. Yes, it is concentrations in the soil. I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question?
Just contrasting the organic, no-till, and the livestock, and specifically the NP and K.
Yeah, it's basically related to management. We know, for example, tillage. The organic system has a lot of tillage in it. Tillage stimulates soil bacteria. Soil bacteria burns up a lot of that organic carbon. With that food for the microbes not being there, soil microbe populations are probably substantially lower in that field. I don't have that data in front of me, but they're probably substantially lower in the field. And it's the activity of those soil microbes that's creating these nutrients to be available for plants as measured in this chart. If that doesn't answer your question, ask some more related to that, and I'll try and answer that some more. I think did I get it, Wayne, or did I miss anything?
Yeah, I think you got it.
Okay.
So, do you have an estimate of how many producers are practicing these techniques and practices?
You know, that's like $1 million question right now with a lot of different NGOs and scientists, and it's a little difficult to get our handle on. Some of the early adopters and innovators have been pretty public about what they're doing, and most people know who they are in their area. They've been used for field days and workshops. But there's people who have watched them and have kind of quietly gone off to the side and are doing things on the back 40, kind of over the hill or behind the trees in case it's a flop. They don't want anybody to know about it. And those are the numbers we're trying to capture. It's kind of an expensive thing to capture. Surveys are something that are relatively cheaper to do versus high-level aerial photography and ground truthing. But there's some work going on to try and capture more of that right now. And, just your standard simple windshield tour as you cruise around the countryside, it makes it pretty clear that there's nowhere near enough producers doing this quite yet. But we do feel we have traction on this in the agricultural community. We do feel it's probably not going to go away, and we are seeing a growing number of producers start to do this. We do encourage producers to start small, so they're not going to convert, a 1,500 acre, 3,000 acre farm in one growing season to a lot of this stuff. They're going to dabble with something like cereal rye on 10 or 20 or 50 acres and move forward from there. So, we want to help them make sure they have successes early on, because successes lead to more innovation, and we just hope to continue to see this moving forward. This is a paradigm shift in agriculture. And paradigm shifts in agriculture, if we go back and look at, pick your paradigm shift, whether it's going from the draft horse power to tractor power, from going from steel wheels to rubber wheels, from going to even Roundup Ready technology. Typical paradigm shifts average about 20 to 25 years. And I know that sounds terribly slow, and it is terribly slow. And looking at all the resource issues we're dealing with, it is terribly slow. We're hoping we can accelerate that. But that's kind of the social aspect of this that we're struggling with. And there are people working on that to try and address it, to help us move things forward and make sure we don't totally screw it up from the social side of things, to encourage more adoption of these practices.
Yeah, a comment came in that it sounds like some sort of crowdsourcing project could help people, and they could do it on Google Earth. So
interesting idea. Thank you
there's
for
a good
that
idea.
Yeah.
Another one, what kind of additional equipment might be necessary to establish cover crops or relay crops, specifically equipment for interseeding? Does it make sense to contract out this work since the equipment is so expensive?
Yes, it does often make times to contract it out, and that creates a whole other business opportunity for like your co-ops to do this. There's aerial application technology. There are Hagee high boys that have been modified. There's people just doing simple broadcast seeding when the corn, for example, is shorter. Even just a no-till drill after corn silage harvest can be highly appropriate, and a lot of soil and water districts have those for rent. There are people who do custom no-till drilling also that could be used. There are specially modified no-till drills or planters to go in between row crop rows, particularly corn, that are out there. But there's a lot of farmers that are pretty darn handy with a wrench and a cutting torch, and have got access to resource piles, or junk piles as they're often known as, or auctions, and they can go out once they get the idea in their head and fabricate their own. I've seen no-till drills just modified by pulling certain no-till units off to match the spacing of the row crops. So it kind of covers the gamut on what's out there for opportunities. It doesn't necessarily have to be brand new, spanky, off the implement dealership lot equipment. Some people are getting by with some pretty low-tech options and ideas out there. So you kind of got to look at what's available to you, what's available in your area. People have fabricated their own units and have turned it into a custom business on the side to help pay for the pieces and parts they didn't have and had to buy. Farmers are pretty innovative folks. Once they get it in their mind, they want to go a certain direction. And so that's going to help move a lot of this forward. There's a lot of assessments going on right now. Again, Scott Wells has just completed a publication. I believe it's going to press here on various interseeding methodologies and some of the success rates with that, and he presented that data on a webinar we did a couple weeks ago. So I encourage you to check that out. That's archived on our website. So yeah, it kind of varies. It depends on how many acres you want to do, where you're at, what's available. The more acres that are available, for example, for an aerial applicator, the more likely they are to be interested in doing it, and some are more interested than others. Some of the co-ops have bought, some of the high boy equipment and have modified that and are doing it as custom because they have a critical mass of producers in their area wanting to do it, and they can justify moving it forward as a business venture. So it totally depends. Groups of farmers going together to do this stuff can make this very cost effective, whether that's sharing equipment, contracting for a custom applicator, or buying cover crop seed in bulk, or other equipment or materials necessarily to do some of these things in bulk can go a long way to moving things forward. And we're starting to see clusters and groups of producers that are starting to work together on this stuff, even if they have different ventures. Some are beef, some are dairy, some are row crop people, and yet they all have an interest in doing this, and they're coming together looking for ways to make this as economical as possible. And I'd encourage them to think also about, how they're going to do their soil testing and monitor what they're doing, particularly something like soil bioprofiling to help measure changes that are going on out there. We are seeing that looking at different metrics on a lot of this stuff, things that kind of got off on a bunny trail there, but that's okay.
Okay, that was the end of our questions. Any other questions wanting to come in?
Easy audience.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you, Kent, and thanks everyone for participating on this webinar. And I'd like to share with you 2 upcoming field days. Kent, you want to get to that slide?
Yep, we'll bring it up.
Yeah, the SFA is going to be sponsoring and hosting two-day field days in August. Dirt Rich Building Soil Health Experts field days, and we're bringing in Dr. Ellen Williams again, and Kent Solberg will also be there. We'll do a lot of delving into the soil bioprofiling that Kent talked about. There'll be 2 days of classroom and 2 days out in the field at each one of these field days. The first one is August 8th and 9th in Faribault, and then the second field days are August 10th and 11th in Blue Earth. And you can go to the SFA website there and find out more details about these 2 field days as well as other soil health events. So with that, I thank Kent for presenting this very informative webinar and everyone for being on, and hope everybody have a great long 4th of July holiday weekend. Thanks again, everyone, and we're signing off. Thank you.